There is a specific kind of silence that only comes with age and a life lived entirely on one's own terms. At 95 years old, Clint Eastwood occupies a space in the American consciousness that is nearly impossible to replicate. He is the last of the iron-willed titans, a man who transformed from a lean, squint-eyed actor in dust-covered ponchos into one of the most sophisticated and economical directors in the history of the medium. But as the sun begins to set on a career spanning over 7 decades, Eastwood is no longer content to let his movies do all the talking. Recently, the man who redefined masculinity and the Western genre has turned his gaze toward the current state of the industry he helped build, and specifically toward figures who represent the modern Hollywood establishment, like Reiner. For decades, Eastwood and Reiner have existed on opposite ends of the cinematic and cultural spectrum, while Reiner became known for a brand of filmmaking rooted in warmth, humor, and eventually, a very loud and public form of political activism. Eastwood remained the quiet observer, the man who believed that the most powerful thing an artist can do is step back and let the audience think for themselves. To the casual observer, any friction between them might look like a simple case of red versus blue, a clash of political ideologies in an increasingly divided country. But as Eastwood pulls back the curtain at 95, he is making it clear that the truth is far more complex and significantly more troubling for the future of film. This is not about a personal grudge or a late-career attempt to settle old scores. In fact, Eastwood speaks of Reiner's talent with a surprising amount of grace, acknowledging the craft and the timing that made Reiner's early work so iconic. The truth Eastwood is finally admitting is a philosophical indictment of what Hollywood has become. He sees Reiner not as an enemy, but as a symbol of a system that has traded curiosity for conformity and storytelling for lecturing. Eastwood's thesis is simple yet devastating. Hollywood used to be a sanctuary for the outsiders and the doubters, but it has transitioned into a place where everyone is desperate to prove they are on the inside, holding the correct opinions. As we trace the path of Eastwood's life from his birth during the Great Depression to his rise as a global icon, we see a man who was forged by the necessity of survival and the reality of hard physical labor. This background created a fundamental distrust of moral certainty and flashy displays of virtue. When he looks at the loud activism and the volume of modern Hollywood figures like Reiner, he does not see progress. He sees a fear of honesty. He sees a generation of filmmakers who are so afraid of being wrong that they have forgotten how to be real. At 95, Clint Eastwood is issuing a warning that echoes far beyond the hills of Los Angeles, that fear kills creativity, and that the moral high ground is a dangerous place to try and make art. This is the story of a legend's final stand against the closing of the American creative mind. To understand why Clint Eastwood looks at the modern landscape of Hollywood with such a detached, critical eye, one must go back to the very beginning, long before the lights and the cameras were even a distant dream. Born Clint Eastwood Jr. on May 31st, 1930, in San Francisco, he entered a world that was rapidly collapsing. The Great Depression was not just a historical event for the Eastwood family. It was the atmosphere they breathed, during an era when stability was a rare luxury and survival was the only priority. The young Eastwood learned early on that nothing in this life is guaranteed. His family was forced to bounce across California, chasing work wherever it could be found. This restless, nomadic childhood did something permanent to his character, carving a deep sense of self-reliance into his bones and teaching him the necessity of keeping his emotions locked tight. As a child, Clint was never the loudest person in the room. He was not flashy or desperate for attention. Instead, he cultivated a habit of staying quiet, watching everything with an observant edge, and speaking only when it truly mattered. This early restraint was not a performance. It was a survival mechanism that would later become his trademark on the silver screen. While other children might have sought validation through noise, Eastwood found his escape in the disciplined rhythms of jazz and the piano. This musical education shaped his internal sense of mood and restraint, a stripped-down style that would eventually define his approach to directing. There was no fast track to fame for a man with his background. There was only the grind. After high school, Eastwood did not head to an elite acting conservatory. He entered the workforce of the common man, hustling through a series of grueling, real-world jobs. He was a lifeguard, a lumberjack, and a gas station attendant. He spent his formative years grinding alongside working-class people, learning the meaning of grit the hard way. This blue-collar reality became the foundation of his worldview, a perspective that never left him even after he reached the heights of global stardom. When he finally drifted into acting after serving in the United States Army, it was almost by accident. And Hollywood certainly did not roll out the red carpet for him. In the mid-1950s, Universal Pictures signed him, but the relationship was far from a fairy tale. Studio bosses were quick to dismiss him, tossing him aside almost as fast as they had discovered him. They were brutal in their assessment, knocking his physical appearance and dragging his voice, claiming he lacked the charisma necessary to be a leading man. These cold, dismissive words were intended to break a young actor's spirit. Instead, they had the opposite effect. They hardened him. Eastwood stayed patient and kept training, taking whatever scraps the industry offered and refusing to bend into a studio puppet. When his break finally came in 1959 with the television series Wide, he spent 8 long seasons playing Rowdy Yates. While the paycheck provided a steady living, he felt creatively boxed in. It was this feeling of being trapped by the conventional American system that prompted his wild move to ditch domestic television for the uncertainty of Italian cinema, a gamble that would eventually change the history of film forever. The decision to leave the comfort of a steady American television paycheck for the dust and heat of Italian film sets was a gamble that shook the industry to its core. When Clint Eastwood teamed up with Sergio Leone for the Dollars trilogy, A Fistful of Dollars, for a few dollars more, and the good, the bad, and the ugly, he did not just revive a flagging career. He forged a cinematic legend. These films did more than just find commercial success. They flipped the entire Western genre upside down by introducing a protagonist that that nobody had ever seen before. Eastwood's man with no name was not the loud, chest-thumping hero of the old school. He was a man of total economy who barely spoke and barely blinked. Yet he dominated every single frame he occupied. That cold stare, that slow walk, and that heavy silence spoke more than paragraphs of dialogue ever could. By stripping away the speeches and the flair, Eastwood rewrote what masculinity looked like on the screen. He was not begging for the audience's approval. His strength came from a terrifying sense of restraint and the feeling that something dangerous was always sitting just under the surface. This was the birth of the anti-hero, a character who lived in the moral gray areas that Eastwood had observed during his own hard Scrabble youth. This revolutionary approach handed him something Hollywood almost never gives away: total control. When he returned to the United States in the late 1960s and 1970s, he was not asking for permission anymore. He was calling the shots. Movies like Dirty Harry turned him into box office gold, but they also sparked a level of controversy that would mirror his later critiques of figures like Rob Reiner. As Harry Callahan, Eastwood played a man who was rough, blunt, and unapologetically unforgiving. Critics argued non-stop about the character. Some saw him as a voice for a public fed up with rising crime, while others labeled him extreme. Eastwood did not flinch at the criticism. He made it clear that his characters were not slogans or political puppets. They were complicated people living in messy, imperfect worlds. What truly shocked the industry was that Eastwood refused to stay in a single lane. He moved fluidly through westerns, action thrillers, dramas, and even comedies. From the dark obsession of Play Misty for Me to the gritty survival of Escape from Alcatraz, he proved he was much more than a tough guy with a gun. Behind the scenes, he was constantly studying, experimenting, and sharpening his instincts. He was learning that the greatest power an artist has is the power to show people who they really are, rather than telling them who they should be. This philosophy of observation over instruction became the bedrock of his career, setting the stage for a decades-long divergence from the increasingly didactic nature of mainstream Hollywood. As Clint Eastwood stepped fully into the director's chair, his filmmaking style became an extension of his own personality. Clean, fearless, and devoid of wasted motion, he developed a reputation for working with incredible efficiency, often utilizing natural light and insisting on very few takes. This was not just about saving time or money. It was a fundamental philosophy of trust. He trusted his actors to find the truth of a scene and allowed stories to breathe naturally instead of forcing them into a predetermined mold. While much of Hollywood was becoming increasingly obsessed with flashy production and heavy-handed lessons, Eastwood's movies landed like quiet punches that stayed with the audience long after the credits rolled. His directorial vision reached a pinnacle with the 1992 masterpiece Unforgiven. In this film, Eastwood did something few icons of his stature would dare. He systematically tore down the myth of the heroic gunslinger that he himself had helped create, by exposing the brutal cost and the messy reality behind the legend. He forced the industry to take him seriously as a profound filmmaking force. The Academy responded by awarding him Oscars for Best Director and Best Picture. But for Clint, the accolades were secondary to the exploration of heavy territory like regret, violence, and the weight of one's choices. He followed this success with a relentless string of hits that further solidified his legacy. From the haunting grief of Mystic River to the gut-wrenching sacrifice in Million Dollar Baby, and the historical complexity of Letters from Iwo Jima, Eastwood proved that his impact crossed all borders. His work was honored not just in America, but also in Europe, where he received multiple César Awards and the prestigious Golden Lion for Lifetime Achievement from the Venice Film Festival. These honors recognized a directing voice that did not rely on one era or one specific hit, but rather a decades-long commitment to exploring moral gray areas and quiet emotion. The essence of Eastwood's directorial lens is a refusal to simplify the human experience. In films like Gran Torino and American Sniper, he continued to stack his legacy by focusing on characters who did not fit neatly into a box. France officially crowned him with the Legion of Honor, recognizing that his influence cut across nations and generations. This international respect was earned because Eastwood stayed timeless. He never shifted his style to match the trends of the decade. While the industry around him began to trade curiosity for certainty, Eastwood remained an outlier, insisting that his job was never to tell people what to think, but to show them the complicated reality of who they are. While his public persona was defined by the iron-willed characters he portrayed, Clint Eastwood's private life was a complex landscape of long-term commitment and significant personal turmoil. Away from the glare of the Hollywood spotlight, his longest and most complicated relationship was his marriage to Margaret Maggie Neville Johnson. They met back in 1953. A time when Clint was far from a household name, grinding through a life of odd jobs with no guarantees of success. At the time, he was a laborer and a lifeguard, chasing acting dreams that seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Maggie was the steady force in his life, providing a sense of balance and intelligence that grounded his unpredictable future. They married in December of 1953, beginning a partnership that would eventually stretch over 3 decades. The early years of their marriage were marked by the stress of financial uncertainty, with Maggie carrying much of the emotional weight while Clint faced constant rejection from the industry. However, when Rewind became a hit in 1959, the trajectory of their lives changed instantly. As his star exploded through The Man with No Name films and the Dirty Harry era, the marriage began to face non-stop strain under the pressure of global fame. This success tested their bond in ways that neither could have predicted. As Clint's schedule grew heavier and his independence became more pronounced. While Clint became a public icon, Maggie deliberately stayed far from the Hollywood noise, choosing a life of privacy and shielding their 2 children, Kyle and Allison, from the industry's chaos. Despite the stability Maggie provided, the marriage was far from smooth. Long stretches of time spent apart became the norm, and Clint's infidelities became widely known, a reality he would later admit to without attempting to dodge the truth. Yet, they remained legally married for decades, tied together by a shared sense of responsibility and duty toward their family. It was not until 1978 that they officially separated, and the subsequent divorce proceedings dragged on until 1984, reflecting how deeply tangled their lives and finances had become. The resulting settlement was one of the largest in Hollywood history, a testament to Maggie's presence during Clint's monumental rise. Even after the split, Maggie's influence on Clint's life never truly disappeared. She had been there before the fame, endured the pressures of his peak, and helped raise their children far from the industry's excess. This long, imperfect history shaped Eastwood's fundamental view of the world. It taught him that human beings are deeply complicated, and that responsibility and ambition often come at a heavy price. This lived experience is why he rejects the simplified, moralistic narratives often found in modern Hollywood. To Eastwood, life is not about being perfect or winning a political argument. It is about navigating the messy, difficult realities of existence. This perspective is what fuels his current reflections on the industry's shift toward conformity and his critique of those who mistake volume for virtue. Now, at 95, Clint Eastwood speaks with a rare clarity that only comes when there is no longer a need to impress the establishment or soften the truth for the sake of the box office. Looking back on over 70 years in the business, he is not just reflecting on his own career, but observing how the industry's soul has shifted. This brings us to his perspective on Rob Reiner, a figure who has become synonymous with a specific brand of modern Hollywood activism. When Eastwood is asked about Reiner, there is no bitterness or cheap shots. Instead, his tone is calm and grounded in a deeper concern that Hollywood has drifted dangerously far from its original mission. Eastwood is quick to give credit where it is due, openly acknowledging Reiner's talent as a filmmaker. He respects Reiner's early work films built on warmth, humor, and real human connection. To Clint, those movies represented a time when the craft of storytelling was more important than the delivery of a message. Back then, stories were designed to bring people together by exploring universal human truths rather than sorting them into opposing political camps. What troubles Eastwood about the current era, as personified by Reiner's public persona, is the shift from curiosity to certainty. In Eastwood's view, Reiner represents a Hollywood circle that now struggles with the very idea of disagreement. He observes that strong beliefs are being confused with the moral high ground, creating an environment where artistic exploration is stifled by the need to win arguments. Clint draws a sharp line between this mindset and his own lifelong philosophy. He has never believed his job was to tell people what to think. He believes his job is to show people who they are, in all their messy, contradictory glory. Even his most controversial films were never meant to be lectures. They were questions posed to the audience, trusting them to think for themselves. According to Eastwood, the real split between him and Reiner is not just about politics, it is about the fundamental nature of art. While he perceives Reiner as wanting to win an argument, Eastwood remains interested in asking the difficult questions. He recalls a time when Hollywood thrived on creative tension, when artists with vastly different views could work side by side without demanding total agreement. Today, he worries that disagreement is treated like a personal flaw rather than a catalyst for growth. To Eastwood, the loud activism of the modern era reflects a trend of entertainers mistaking volume for virtue. He warns that moral certainty closes the very doors that storytelling is supposed to leave open. The truth that Clint Eastwood is finally admitting at 95 is not explosive because of a scandal. It is powerful because of its quiet, wary sadness. It is the reflection of an artist who has watched his industry trade the unpredictability of the human spirit for the safety of conformity. To Eastwood, Hollywood was once a sanctuary where the outsiders and the misunderstood belonged, a place where you could be flawed, silent, or even dangerous, and still find a home on the screen. Now, he sees a landscape where everyone is desperately trying to prove they are on the inside, clinging to approved opinions like life rafts in a sea of public judgment. His critique of Reiner is ultimately a critique of this loss of creative courage. While Reiner is comfortable within a system that prizes outrage and moral high ground, Eastwood remains the eternal outlaw, standing on the outskirts. He has reached an age where he has zero interest in settling scores or holding on to grudges. What matters to him now is not the number of trophies on his shelf or his standing at the box office. It is the fundamental freedom to tell a story without a filter. He would far rather make a film that makes an audience uncomfortable than one that tells them they are perfect, just as they are. As he looks toward the next generation of filmmakers, his warning is clear: fear is the poison of art. If you are too afraid to be honest because of how it might be perceived, you have already lost the battle for creativity. Eastwood's life, from the poverty of the Depression to the heights of global fame, was built on the idea that strength comes from restraint and truth comes from observation. He remains the man with no name, still watching, still waiting, and still refusing to bend to the noise of the crowd. The legacy of Clint Eastwood won't be defined by a single role or a single political stance. It will be defined by his refusal to simplify the world. He leaves us with the reminder that the most important stories are often the ones that do not have easy answers. In a world of loud certainties, perhaps it is the quiet questions that we need the most.